Thank you. Thank you. Let me get this out of the way so we don't get two microphones at one time. All right, so welcome to this opening session of the conference. And let me jump right in by starting with, so what do I mean by automation Armageddon? Because I chose that title on purpose. And I really do mean nothing less than the end of the world of building automation and controls as we know it, as we've known it for a couple of decades now. That from my perspective, having looked at this and studied it and written on it for a couple of years now, I'm convinced that the adoption of LED lighting systems, with the emphasis on the word systems, is going to create disruption in the industry we're familiar with, dramatic change, change that will threaten incumbents who are currently successful in the current model, and create all kinds of interesting opportunities for companies that are agile enough to take advantage of them, or new companies that maybe haven't played in our space and would like to. So let me start by answering some questions that you might have already, because in your seat I would. Not the least of which is, how could LEDs have such an impact? Right? I mean, lighting controls as a whole is only a small part of the overall controls world, and for the most part it's a peripheral part. Right? Most major controls projects do a lot of things. Lighting's a piece of it, but only a piece. And LEDs are just a piece of lighting. So how can a piece of a piece have such a big impact? By 8:50 today, I hope you have an answer to that question. I'll give you a couple ideas. Second question you might ask is, well, if that were going to happen, and if it were that dramatic, how long do we have? Right? Our industry has a rather long historical time constant for technology change, so how about this one? How long do we have before we have to worry about this impact? And then I want to spend a few minutes on, as an owner-operator specifier, what you might want to do if you're persuaded that, in fact, there will be this change and it will be soon enough that it's within your career lifetime. What might you want to be doing? And then the same conversation for suppliers and integrators who maybe have a slightly different set of things they need to focus on so that this change becomes an advantage to them and not a problem for them. So that's what we'll do today over the course of the next 50 minutes or so. For those of you that have CEUs, these are the published learning objectives. I hope you get a whole lot more out of it than that, but that's sort of the baseline, right? Understanding the drivers behind LED adoption today and how that's going to change. Understanding the disruptive potential of LED systems in the building automation environment. And then finally, recognizing in emerging controls opportunities that are going to derive from this LED lighting retrofits that I believe are going to happen on a scale we have yet to really understand. So let's jump right in. How can LED systems really have this kind of impact? We're going to talk about three different things that might drive LEDs to have this kind of impact. I believe they'll increase the sheer number of controls projects by an order of magnitude. Just that is going to have a huge impact on the industry, and we'll talk about that. I believe lighting systems are going to move lighting to the center of automation from the periphery where it has existed for a long time. And that has tremendous implications for the industry. And I believe it's going to reduce the application programming component of automation by an order of magnitude. And we'll talk about that one for a couple of minutes. So let's focus on this question of how can LED systems have this kind of impact? So let's start with this idea that increasing controls project by a factor of 10. How might that come about? A couple of years ago, I was invited to speak at Lawrence Berkeley National Labs to the research team there that's looking at energy efficiency in controls. And we talked a little bit about this very topic, because I suggested the same thing to them. And so we put together a little hypothesis that might support that. And what we said was, based on lots of available data, there are maybe 5 million or so buildings in North America, commercial buildings, that could have controls. Maybe 10 or 20% actually do have any digital controls. And over the next 10 years, we're going to come back to the big if LED lighting systems were retrofitted to half those buildings, and if all of LED systems had controls, both of those ifs we're going to address pretty quickly here, then you'd have to come up with 250,000 projects for controls per year just in the US. And you'd have to do that really over 10 years, so it wouldn't really be 250,000 a year because it'll ramp up to some peak. So maybe the peak number is 300,000 or 400,000 controls projects in a year. That'll change. That'll change the industry we live in. Now, what'll drive that 50% adoption rate? That's sort of the key number there, right? Because if history is any guide, you'd expect the adoption rate in 10 years to be less than that. So what'll drive it? Well, the first thing, of course, is energy efficiency. We know that LEDs use less energy than traditional lighting, and that's a fine thing. And energy efficiency retrofits tend to be driven by return on investment. How much money do I pay? How much money do I get? Well, LEDs keep getting a little more efficient, so the get part is a little bit bigger. But the really important thing, the thing not so many people know, is this thing called Haitz's law. Right? Every silicon technology has a law, so do LEDs. Turns out that the dollars per lumen, that is the cost per unit of light for LEDs, has been declining at a rate of something like 10x per decade for several decades, and there's no reason to believe that won't continue for the next decade or so. What that means is the cost of the actual LED, the actual light source, is dropping by half every 3 years. So the applications where the ROI makes sense today are one set of the industry. Go out 3 years, that set will be bigger. Go out 6 years, it'll be dramatically bigger. So just on energy efficiency, the controls projects opportunities with LEDs are going to grow dramatically. Enough to get us to 50%? Yeah, I don't think so. But that's not the only thing driving us there. Another thing that's going to drive us there is the regulatory environment. Right? There are two parts of regulations that are driving us to more rapid adoption of LED systems and associated controls. One, of course, are just energy efficiency standards. The energy density per square foot, given that we want to maintain optimum lighting levels, that continues to push for more efficient light, that drives people to LEDs, all well and good. The other part of regulatory environment that's driving people is the need for when you put in a lighting system, you're required to put in controls. You can't just put in LED lighting in a lot of places and in probably all places pretty soon, even if you wanted to. And I'm going to try to persuade you you'd never want to anyway in a minute. But even if you wanted to, a lighting retrofit now has to go with a certain level of controls. And that level of controls is going to continue to increase because that's what regulatory environments do. Right? As the technology moves, they try to move the industry with it. So we can expect to see not only more efficient and better ROIs driving this volume, but also regulatory environment that pushes it. And will those two get us up to 50% in 10 years? I don't think so. But those aren't the only two things we have to work with. There's a third thing, and it has to do with the science of light. So people have started calling this technology light recipes. Light recipes. And what that's doing is trying to take the science of light and apply it to commercial applications. So I worked for Philips Lighting for a number of years, and I got to go to the experience lab for lighting that Philips runs. And they sat me down in the middle of this big circular room with all kinds of visual tools, screens and things, as well as a whole lot of lighting installations. And over the course of an hour, they showed me both intellectually and viscerally how light affects people. So the researchers who have studied light know light affects people. The rest of us know that if we've spent a week in Seattle followed by a week in Phoenix. We know light affects people too. However, it hasn't been made commercial before because it hasn't been very practical to make light dynamic before. Dynamic light with LEDs is simple. LEDs are happy to change color temperature. They're happy to change intensity. It's not even very hard to change the absolute color with LED systems. So all of a sudden, we have all these other dimensions of light we can use, and the science says there's value there. How do we tap that value? And how far away is it to tap that value? Those are really important questions because this may drive LED adoption faster than either one of the other two we've talked about. Let's talk about a couple of examples. Move from science maybe to real application. Philips has a product, School Vision. It's being installed in Germany based on real research with real data. And what it says is, if you control the lighting in an elementary school differently than just standard fluorescent, if you have even just 4 different settings of intensity and color temperature combinations, and you use those different settings intelligently relative to what you're trying to get the students to do at any given time, you can improve learning outcomes. You can improve reading speed. You can reduce errors. You can reduce classroom misbehavior. One of the statistics that's not up here, a 13.8% improvement in educational outcomes in elementary school. Just from light. Controlled studies. This kind of thing might drive LED adoption even more aggressively than ROI. This is value creation. And it's not just education. Look at retail. The last 5 or 10 years, a lot of work's been done on the impact of buyer behavior in the context of visual experience and lighting in particular. Some things are intuitively obvious, but they've been researched and studied now. Like, for example, the correct use of color temperature and intensity of light can focus shopper attention. And if you're a retailer and you have some clearance things you want to get rid of, as all retailers do from time to time, it might be really handy to be able to manage your lighting system to accelerate that process. That would be called top-line revenue. Or maybe you want to highlight your new collection, beginning of the season, when the revenue and margins on that are at their peak. All right? That's called value creation. That's top-line revenue. And that doesn't even get into the more subtle parts of light management for consumer behavior. There are also studies going on that suggest people buy more at dusk, and not just because it's after work, but because of the way light affects people. So maybe you want to have a dusk at lunchtime when people are flocking to your store at lunchtime. I don't know where it will go, but I'm very convinced the science of light is going to make dynamic light a very significant value creator, and that's going to be a big part of driving LED adoption. And it's not just retail, and it's not just education. Another obvious place is healthcare. Philips also has a product that they put out for a while called Heal Well. And that's a lighting solution targeted at patient rooms, and it tries to use the light to manage the patient's circadian rhythm after a stroke, specifically trying to recover the original rhythm, because it gets all messed up in the process of recovery from stroke. And what they found, again, controlled studies, are that when they do that well, patients sleep longer at night, they go to sleep faster, and they have less depression, which is a natural part of the healing process from a stroke. Those are real outcomes. That's value creation. If you could choose a hospital that has it and one that doesn't, where would you go? Right, so LED lighting, because it can be dynamic, if it's associated with controls, has the potential to add value to the building, not just reduce cost. And that changes the equation about adoption rates. That makes our assumptions about adoption based on energy efficiency risky. Risky if you're in this business, either as an owner-operator or as a supplier. Now, of course, there's another really big part of commercial buildings called offices, where measuring outcomes is a lot tougher. People have tried to figure out how to measure productivity outcomes for a long time. They're still trying, and they will get it. Right? It's just a matter of research. They will figure that out and be able to measure it, quantify it, and turn it into a clear value proposition for owners. And when they do, it's going to be very significant. Research has already demonstrated real productivity change if you can give people control of their local environment. So if I can control my color temperature and my intensity in my workstation separate from everybody else's, overall we're going to get better productivity and less absenteeism. That's value creation. That makes a building more valuable to its tenants. That's not just cost reduction. I think if you put all those together, the declining cost of LEDs and therefore the rising ROI, the regulatory environment that's pushing you to lower energy densities, and this potential for creating value, real value out of LED lighting systems, I think you can make a pretty good case. The 10x increase in controls volume is not unreasonable. 10 times more projects than we have today. What's that going to mean? But that's not the only way LEDs are going to have more impact. Another equally important way, especially for the supplier community, is that it's going to put lighting at the center of automation instead of on the peripheral edge. Here's how I think it's going to do that. Historically, large automation projects, most automation projects, start with energy efficiency in HVAC. And they move into other things, right? You certainly get into, maybe come from access control sometimes, There's frequently lighting retrofits around energy efficiency, but they're not about controls as a rule. If controls are there at all, they're probably standalone, or the interconnection with the rest of building automation is pretty simple. A schedule exchange or an occupancy signal or something like that. Pretty straightforward stuff. So you can argue lighting controls are on the edges of the controls automation world. They're not going to stay there. And here's why. There's both research, there's conference presentations, and there are real products which recognize that once you put LEDs in lighting systems, you have electronics, you have silicon. They need to be communicating anyway so you can control them. So they're going to have wireless. They're going to have, why not, sensors. And if you're going to put sensors and communication in them, why wouldn't you put every kind of sensor in them? It's just silicon. It's just silicon. Think of all the sensors in your phone. So why not put an occupancy sensor in every light fixture? Why not put a personal presence sensor in every light fixture? Why not put light sensing in every one? Why not put temperature in every one? And if I do all that, the in-space sensing for building automation is going to flow from lighting to everything else. If you're doing access control and monitoring where people are in the building, you're going to do that through the lighting infrastructure. If you want to know the temperatures in the room, you're going to do that through the lighting infrastructure because it's free. Why would you run another network, another set of sensors? So this is going to move lighting to the center. But that's not all lighting might do at the center. Light fixtures are inherently available power, right? There has to be power because you have light. They're full coverage. Every building has light in it. Even if you don't have light on in the room, the fixture's still there. Lighting tends to be high physical density, much higher physical density than most existing sensors, and it has onboard electronics already. So it just comes with the lighting system in the first place. But it also turns out that LEDs are not a bad source of lighting, a lighting communication network either. Right? The visible light we see from a fluorescent tube or an incandescent is pretty stable. The light from an LED can switch very quickly that you wouldn't notice, but a light sensor on the wall would. If that light sensor were attached to something you wanted to control in the room, I can control things in the room from my light fixture, using the light fixture as a network in the space. Now, it would be interesting if that were just a theory. There are products today that are starting to do that. So think about that. The lighting platform becomes the center of all sensors, at least in the space, and at least provides an opportunity for in-space communications with no other infrastructure than the lighting infrastructure itself. How significant is that change going to be for products, systems, and solutions in building automation? I think pretty dramatic. And as I said, this isn't just theory. There are products already coming out. Is this company going to be successful? I don't know. I don't know. But I think they have the right idea. Take LED lighting systems and integrate the things that are easy to integrate and will add real value in the larger scale systems. Take lighting from being a component to a core part of an automation system. Same thing with this company. I don't know if they'll be successful as an individual company, but the idea that lighting systems and controls are going to be cloud-based, I think is almost fundamental. Right? Most new things being done are moving into the cloud for a whole lot of reasons that I won't spend time on here. But lighting is starting there. Lighting controls around LEDs are starting there. The rest of building automation has been someplace else, either on a local facility manager's desk, or more currently in the IT server room, or maybe even the IT server cloud, but in the IT environment in a managed software package for a long time. It has to move to get to the cloud. Lighting is already going to be in the cloud. How much easier is it going to be to take other systems in a building and route them to the cloud through lighting than change the other systems? These things are going to move lighting to the center of building automation from the peripheral edges. So I think we can make a pretty good case that that's going to happen. Right? That lighting is going to become a much more core part of building automation where projects start and where the infrastructure is built off of. But there's this third item, reducing application programming by a factor of 10. So one part of my background is EE, right? I wrote programs in hex. I did macro assemblers. I did a few languages higher than that before I moved out of programming, but I like programming. I don't like the idea it goes away. And so the good news is I'm not talking about software going away. Right? Building automation is software intense now. It's going to get more software intense over the next few years, like almost everything else. The difference is that software is going to be moved more and more into components and intelligent systems and less into application-specific programming. And let me tell you why I think that is the case. Let's go back to LB&L for a minute. So remember this slide here. The key thing about this slide for this part of our discussion is the bottom line. 250,000 projects a year, maybe 300,000 or 400,000 projects a year. How does that happen when those projects require very skilled people with specialized knowledge in controls and programming? It doesn't. So what do we do about that? Do we not do it? Do we tell users who want to have value creation from LED systems they can't have it because we don't have enough controls engineers? I don't think so. I think when there's a demand, people find a way. People find a way. So how might this come about? Well, I don't know quite, but I know the end game is make controls so simple anyone can do it. Now, if this guy were focused on controls instead of on music and phones, do you really think we'd be doing controls application development the way we do it today? I don't think so. I think we'd be doing it different, a lot different. An example, maybe, a recent example. A few years ago, well, not that many, in the old days, let's put it that way. In the old days, if I wanted to create a reasonably decent high-definition video, and I wanted to edit it a little bit, and I wanted to maybe put some titles in it, and then post it on the web where somebody could see it, I would have to have some pretty good skills, or bring someone in who does, some pretty expensive software, a fair amount of time. And I could get it done. Nowadays, I can do it in 20 seconds from here to YouTube. It doesn't take any real effort. I don't need any particular skills. And actually, it's darn near free. And it's not because the technical problem got easier. It's because people figured out how to wrap the technical complexity in a simple user experience. And that's what has to happen in controls. And it's not a small thing when it does. There was no YouTube until 2005 or 6. That's only 8 years ago, people. And today, 100 hours per second of video is going into YouTube. From nothing to 100 hours per second, 7, 8 years. If you'd stood there 9 years ago and said that's going to happen, everybody would have said that's impossible. There is no path. And there wasn't any path until there was a need. And then all of a sudden, people figured out how to build a path. And it wasn't in one piece. It wasn't just the phone, and it wasn't just YouTube. It's both of those and a bunch of other pieces that makes that work. It's that evolving system that works together. And that's what we're going to see happen in controls. Right? Because it has to get so simple anyone can do it, or we can't meet the user demand to take advantage of the opportunities that LED lighting systems are going to provide. So before I came here, I was in Detroit. I went to Detroit to go to a 40th anniversary party for my cousins. Hard to believe they've been married 40 years, but it has been. So I went to their party, and when I got to Detroit, I rented a car, happened to be a Hertz car, and so I pulled out my little phone, and in 20 seconds, I had it connected over Bluetooth. So driving up to the party, which was a good hour away, I went to Pandora, and I played the music channels I'm used to and like to listen to. No problem at all. When I got to the party, it turned out that the flower girl from 40 years ago, a very petite young lady still, actually had her flower girl dress and actually could kind of almost wear it. So there were some very amusing pictures I took, again with my phone, while I was there. And then I had to drive back to the airport, and there were some traffic hang-ups here and there because they're doing construction in Detroit. I think that's sort of a pastime there. They're always doing construction in Detroit. So they were working on the streets, and I didn't really want to get caught up in any of that, so I just took my phone and went to Google Maps and said, okay, route me someplace. And they said, well, if you go this way, it's 5 hours. If you go this way, it's 28 minutes. That's an easy choice, 28 minutes. Went back to the airport. And what struck me about that is that phone is not as good as the satellite radio that came in the Hertz car. but it's good enough. It doesn't have all the talk channels that Sirius has, but I didn't want those. So it was good enough for me. Same thing with the camera. My camera phone is not as good as my actual digital camera. But it was good enough for this cute little picture, and it'll be fine to post on the web. And my Garmin has a certain advantage over my phone, which is it sticks to my windshield, and I can see the map really easy, and I don't have that for my phone. So actually, it's not quite as good as my Garmin either, in that sense. But I used all three, and they were good enough. And I think that applies to controls, too. The truth is, a lot of commercial buildings in the US don't need really super sophisticated controls. Any reasonable controls would improve their efficiency enormously, and if what you're after is the value created by lighting, that's going to come from a whole new class of controls, which are designed to be easy in the first place, because the people are starting from that assumption it has to be simple. So the need for complexity will be reduced a bit as people settle for less. I mean, if you could do a whole controls application for, let's say, 20% less, that's driven by a lighting need, and the efficiency of lighting and the value created by lighting swamp the savings of HVAC, are you going to pay the last 20% to make HVAC 1% more efficient? Maybe not. Maybe you settle for, I'll go with 98% of what I can get for 20% less cost. So I really think you can make a case, and a pretty good case, that controls programming, application controls programming as a part of the business is going to shrink dramatically and become a fairly specialized business over the next 10 years. And if you put these three things together, right, the potential to increase the number of controls projects by a factor of 10, to decrease the amount of application programming by the same factor, and to put lighting at the center of automation, I think you can make a pretty good case that we're somewhere on the right-hand side of this probability chart about can LEDs really have such a significant impact. I'm persuaded they really can, and they really will. And whether you're an owner-operator, specifier, integrator, consultant, or product supplier, you're going to care about this, because the world's going to be different. The product's going to be different, the service is going to be different, the value chain is going to be different. And those differences are going to make your business either more successful or less. And the scary thing is, the more successful it is now, the harder it's going to be to make it successful on that trajectory later. So those of you that have very successful businesses in building automation, you might want to be worried. This is not going to be static. What makes you successful now may not be enough to make you successful later. In fact, history says it might get in your way. So let's move on to the next kind of important question. How long do we have? Right? There are dramatic changes coming. If they're in 40 years, most of us can say, not my problem. If they're in 5 years, nobody can say, not my problem. So where is it? When's it coming? The exact answer is, well, I don't know the exact answer. If I knew it, I would tell you, but I don't. But I can give you some thoughts to think about. Let's start with this. We know it can't happen until the enabling technologies that support it are in place and ready to go. So let's look at those for a second. One thing we need to make this vision happen is robust and available wireless technology, right? We need to have things like Wi-Fi, things like mesh networks. We need to have even personal presence networks, things like iBeacon, things like that. If you look at the world around you, you're going to see all those are available now. Right? There's nothing in there you can't do. You can do Wi-Fi today. There's Zigbee stuff floating around in a variety of building automation components, and the iBeacon stuff is pretty new. But if you walk into a room with your cell phone and your Bluetooth turned on, you're going to find there are rooms that will know you're there, and the room will know it's you. And that kind of technology is now becoming available. It's not widely used yet, but it's becoming available. So I would say wireless is pretty well set. Another technology that has to be there is the cloud. Right? If we're presuming that the cloud's going to have an impact on how this industry develops, the cloud has to be there. I don't think anyone would argue that the cloud isn't there yet. Not just the sort of traditional cloud of outsourcing IT to the cloud, but even the most fundamental recognized desktop application in the world, right? Microsoft Office, can now be done as a cloud service. So there's not much you can't do from the cloud, so there's no reason to think the cloud's going to be an obstacle to moving forward. So the cloud's probably ready for us if we're ready for it. The third thing you need as an enabling technology is a way to allow lighting to come to the center of automation, which means that the interconnection between lighting and HVAC and access control and all the other parts of building automation needs to be robust, needs to be reliable, and it needs to be standard in order for that to work. Good news is we've had BACnet now for 20 years here in North America as a standard, more than 10 years in the rest of the world as an ISO standard, and that's exactly what it does. Right? It provides the object models, the service models, and the data models to allow you to communicate at the lowest level of building automation, devices and sensors, all the way up through web-enabled applications with a consistent set of nomenclature and models. So the technology for moving pieces around in terms of their importance and how they interact with each other is clearly in place. So this is either a good news story or a bad news story, depending on your point of view. If you'd like to retire before this change happens, this is not good news. If you'd like to see this change happen quickly, this is really good news. The infrastructure enabling things are there. What else do we have to look at? Well, if we think about the traditional time constant in the industry, and that's a fair place to start, the traditional driver for energy efficiencies, right, save energy, ROI, that process by which that decision gets made is typically done in the context of a return on investment for some capital expenditure, and it gets lined up on a shelf by CFO types with all kinds of other capital investments they could make with return on investments of various sizes and flavors, and decisions get made about investing. And the driver for that, the person who brings that there, is typically facilities management, right? Maybe energy management. When lighting provides new value, not just cost reduction, that equation might change a little bit. So when you're talking about, for example, a retailer and saying, well, if you went to this lighting system, you might improve your top line by 0.1%, you're not talking to the CFO anymore. Right? When you talk to a healthcare organization and say, you can improve your patient outcomes, you're not talking to a CFO anymore. You're talking about the mission-centric purpose of the business. And when you talk about the mission-centric purpose of the business and making investments there, you're talking to CEOs. You're talking to people who can say, yes, we're going to do that, and just do it. It still has to have a positive ROI, right? So it's still going to take time to get to that point. But you're talking at a different level to a different set of people who can make things happen in a different way and at a different pace than we've seen in this industry before. So when you're thinking about how long might this take, you need to factor that in. The struggle and the push that you facility managers have to get capital things approved, CEOs don't have that struggle. When they're persuaded it's the right thing to do, it gets done. And when you have light systems as a value creation tool in a business, that's what you get. You get CEOs who say, hey, I need this to compete in my business. If my hospital down the street can say that, I better be able to say that. If the retailer across the street is doing that, I better be able to do that. If the office building I'm competing with for that tenant can do that, I better be able to do that. Those are the kind of discussions that might accelerate this change beyond what you would think if you just looked at, so what have we done with energy efficiency before? So think about that a little bit. That's clearly a potential accelerator. What else might accelerate things? Well, not that long ago, if you wanted to do some kind of photo retouching, right? Red eye removals or blemish elimination or contrast enhancement, those kind of things, you'd buy a package and put it on your desktop and you'd run it. And Photoshop was probably the premier one you'd buy. And there were a couple. And they were expensive. They're clunky, hard to use, at least for us non-professionals. And there they were. So a couple days ago, I went up on the Android store for my phone, just for grins, and said, so what could I do with photo editing in a cloud app? Well, it turns out there are dozens. So I pulled down the logos for a few of them just to make a slide. But the truth is, all of those will do photo editing. Most of them will do things like red eye reduction and blemish removal and contrast enhancement and color enhancement and all those things that used to be hard. Well, then, one, they're not hard anymore. They're pretty easy. You push the button, you get more or less what you thought. But more importantly, there are dozens of them instead of 1 or 2 or 3. And that world didn't exist until 6 years ago. I'll call it 7, when the Apple Store really got going around the iPhone. right? So the development time, the development trajectory, when you're dealing with things that can live in the cloud, is radically different. The other thing that's different about those is not just they got developed in a very short time, they got developed by a lot of different people, and a lot of them are tailored for very narrow audiences. There's actually a picture editing program specifically for making your pictures more romantic. I don't know what it does, but I thought that was interesting. And there are other ones targeted at other specific audiences and objectives. So the ability to build smaller applications that are much more targeted, and by the way, these at least are virtually free, comes along with the move to an application cloud-oriented industry. So when we think about our industry and say, well, how fast can it move? I mean, you've got to write all that stuff. Someone's got to develop all that stuff for lighting controls that we've done over 20 years for other kinds of controls. Someone's got to figure out how to write light recipe stuff and how to use it. Well, my point is that in the world where you're dealing with cloud and cloud application developers, there's a huge number of people who can contribute to that, and the development cycle may be far, far shorter than you think. So it's another thing to think about when you're saying, well, how long is it going to take for this change to get here? One more place we might look. Right? We can look at history. Now, history is an imperfect guide because there's no perfect analogy, right? There's nothing that's been done before that we're doing exactly the same. We're not taking this industry through the same change it's gone through before. Everyone is different. So I won't try to claim that the historical precedents are exactly applicable, but maybe they're instructive. So the classic example of this kind of transition, where the industry dramatically changes its structure, where the value chain changes, is sort of the transition from mini computers to PCs that happened in the sort of 80s time frame. Right? So that took about 10 years. And in that 10 years, Wang, say one of the largest, most successful of those office automation companies, with $1 billion in revenue, back when $1 billion was real money, by 1990 didn't exist. And Data General and Digital Equipment Corp weren't far behind. So maybe that was a 10-year transition where there's a value chain that changes in the industry, kind of like we're talking about here. A more recent example, a more recent example than that. Let's see, how about, a few years ago, not that many at least, phones used to look more like this, right? This was sort of your typical little phone. And it was pretty smart, actually. I know they invented new ones called smartphones, but this was pretty smart. It could hold 1,000 contacts, a couple phone numbers for each one, and it could find it in 2 seconds, and I could download ringtones. It was actually kind of smart. But the dominant player in these phones, before Apple came along, Nokia. 55 to 70% market share, depending on how you count. 55 to 70%. Nokia's share today, 13%. How long did that take? Well, the iPhone came out in June of 07. First Android phone was October of 08. 6, 7 years, from king of the mountain to almost nothing. In fact, sold to a company that never made a phone before. It's just a data point. I want to argue it's the same as our industry, but it's worth thinking about. Things are going faster than they used to. And when there are new players in the market, think IT players, think semiconductor players, things move more quickly because they're not going to wait for our traditional timelines. So I think if you look at the enabling technology being in place and the fact that there's new value creation that's going to drive or accelerate this change, and the cloud connection that's going to enable some of that rapid change, and if you're interested in the historical precedents, there's lots more of them. Whatever time you think it's going to take, it's probably less. It's probably less. I can tell you, having seen some of the research while I was in Philips, that the predictions of the whole industry, including Philips, about LED adoption from, say, 2010 till now were wrong. All of them were wrong. They were all very conservative compared to what actually has happened. Adoption has gone much faster than people thought. Just a data point. But maybe it's relevant to how fast will this really happen. So if the change is going to be this dramatic, and it's going to happen in a time frame we care about, and I'm persuaded both of those are really true, maybe more true than even we understand now, how, as an owner-operator, would you cope with this? What would you do given that this is going to happen? What would you do now? What would you do then? I'd have a couple of suggestions. First of all, I'd pay attention. But I've shown you a couple little examples of LED systems announcements, but they're out there. It's not hard to set up a Google alert or some other mechanism to keep track of and just glance at what's going on in the lighting systems industry, because it's likely to take people a bit by surprise. It's not where they would expect the next big thing in automation to come from. When people think of LEDs, they think of efficiency. There's a whole other part of LEDs, which is systems, which may be way more important in terms of changing our industry than just efficiency. So you need to pay attention to that, see what's happening, see who the players are, pay some attention to the pace of change. The second thing is those enabling technologies. You don't have to wait for this change to start learning about and implementing those technologies. If you have a project and you have an opportunity to install wireless and learn a bit more about how that works in your world, do that. Do that. If you have an opportunity to install a system which has a cloud-based platform, if you can, do that. Learn from that, because it's going to become central to what you care about later. Please don't install a system that doesn't have BACnet or some comparable infrastructure for integration. Because moving lighting from the periphery to the middle, to the core of automation, requires a very robust infrastructure of data communications in order to make that work, to be able to build all the links between the new version of a lighting platform and the rest of building automation. As an owner-operator, as a specifier, as a consultant, you want to stay very close to the suppliers. Right? Suppliers are going to be the people who actually make this happen. Right? Owner-operators need it, but only suppliers can provide it. So talking to your suppliers so you understand their view of where this is going, their timeline for getting there, is critical to your success. You can't get there without your suppliers. You also want to understand where your suppliers are headed. Right? If your suppliers are not going the same direction you think the industry is, you need a plan B. You need a plan B. Just like any other supplier assessment. This needs to be part of your thinking about who can support me going forward. If you see this change happening, if you want to take advantage of light recipes to build value for your organization, you need to have suppliers either on your team or at least in mind to put on your team later who are going there with you. Now, how about if you're a supplier and an integrator? That's a little tougher, right? There's a little more to do there, which is, again, is a good news, bad news thing, because if you do it well, you can be the next big winner. If you don't do it well, life is going to get tough. So let's talk about this just a little bit. Of course, you also need to pay attention to what's going on. If you're involved in building automation as a supplier or an integrator, and you don't have any component of your business tied to lighting, you need to make a conscious effort to go out and learn about lighting and what's going on in lighting systems. Because I'm not sure how much longer you can have automation businesses that don't have some interaction with lighting platforms. For next year? Sure. 5 years? I'm not so sure. 10 years? I'm pretty sure you can't. So if your business doesn't have a lighting part, get connected to the lighting part, even if it's not part of your business yet. Same thing about enabling technologies. If your platforms you're using, if the work you're doing isn't taking advantage of the wireless things that are available today, or the cloud-based things available today, you want to think about that. If you don't have the ability, or the tools, or the products to integrate systems around BACnet, get them. Get them, because you're going to need them as this world moves toward a lighting-centric automation environment. And then there's the issue of user experience. Right? You really need to have a passion, I think, as a supplier, whether it's products or systems or integration. You need a passion for user experience simplicity. So let me tell you what I mean by that. So making controls so simple anyone can do it. I think that's a mantra we need to adopt, but what does it mean? How simple is simple enough? And that's a relevant question. Right? So you look at the evolution of IT technology over time. It has progressively got less complicated at the user end, or at least that's what they would tell us. Those of us that have to use it might have a different view of that. But is that simple? Are any of those simple? I don't think so. I don't think so. Let me tell you what I think simple is. So when my mom was 82, right, I have 8 brothers and sisters. And my mom really wanted to get pictures of all her grandkids all the time. Now, some of us would be diligent and take our digital cameras and make prints out of them, although it's kind of an odd thing to do anymore, and send them to her by mail. But that was a pretty limited thing. Not all of us were up to that all the time. It didn't do much for pictures you take on your phone and put on Facebook. So she didn't really get what she wanted, and at 82, she wasn't going to play with computers. You know, we bought her the best ones we could find with user interfaces that are simple and not going to happen. And my dad was 84, and he was not going there, not going there. Even getting a wireless network to run in their place for very long wasn't going to happen, unless one of us was there to take care of it. And we were mostly remote, so taking care of it wasn't going to work. And then we found something that's really simple. So simple, my mother could use it, right? And it was this product here. It's called Visit, or Visit Me, whatever they called it at the time. And it was a very cool product because it looks like a photo frame. You would swear it is a photo frame. The only difference between this and a photo frame is if you plug it into the wall, and then you go someplace else, and you send an email to this magic address in the sky, and attach a picture, it shows up on the frame. And it shows up there with no wireless connection, or at least none that you know about. It's not Wi-Fi. They had done some magic and buried the complexity of a 2G connection under this thing so that it could get data streamed, not real fast, not instantly, but the picture showed up there with zero effort on either end. Send an email, it shows up. That's simple. That's what I mean by simple. It needs to be that simple. So simple, anybody can do it. That's the target for controls. If you're a supplier or an integrator building user interfaces, that's the target. Would I argue it's an easy target for controls? No, it's not easy. It's technically not easy, but even more importantly, from a mind share point of view, it's not easy. We've never been challenged to do that kind of thing quite like that. We've always thought buttons and meters and that's good enough. Well, maybe it's not good enough. Maybe it's not. The people who figure that out, by the way, those people are going to be successful. However, I made the same presentation to those researchers at LB&L, and they're sharp guys, and they're like, yeah, that's fine, that's good. But we all know, when it comes to energy efficiency and green, we all have great intentions, but we tend to be a little bit laggard in implementing because we really don't use that stuff. And so it needs to be more than just so simple everyone can use it. It needs to be so compelling everybody will. So let me tell you another story. Now, in my marriage, my wife is kind of the green person, right? I mean, I'm not about wasting energy, but I'm not quite as watching every microwatt as she is. So we bought a new car a couple years ago, and she wanted us to buy a hybrid, and I was like, that's fine, we can buy a hybrid, no problem. It was a car I was going to drive, so as long as it had enough pickup in it, it was a nice car, I was happy with it. And as long as it looked nice and was a hybrid, she was happy with it. So we settled on this Lincoln MKZ. And I started driving it. I've been driving it 3 years now, and wouldn't you believe, that darn thing has changed my behavior. I would not have believed it. But you got to understand, that left-hand red box there, right? There's a dual meter there. It's showing real time on the left, the power to the wheels from the battery, and on the right side of it there, the power to the wheels from the gas engine, because it's a parallel hybrid, it does both at once, and pushing the battery one up, and it got to be kind of a game. And then on the right-hand side, instantaneous miles per gallon, and then that sliding graph of the last 10 minutes, average miles per gallon, topped off with that actual lifetime miles per gallon, which by the way is 42.1, which I think is pretty darn good for a car that size, thank you very much. It has changed my behavior. I have noticed that when you go up a hill, if you ease off a little on the accelerator, let the battery take over going over the hill, up goes the mileage. I've learned pretty viscerally 63, 65, and 68 on the freeway are not the same in terms of mileage. Heaven forbid, 75. So if I have to get there, okay, 75. If I don't have to get there in a hurry, maybe 65 is good enough because it pushes up my numbers. So this has been great. This is behavior modification because some clever person implemented a user experience that drags me in. It's compelling. It's got me using it when I would not have believed I would do that. I also talked about this with my friends at LB&L, and a real sharp researcher in the back of the room raised his hand and said, Andy, that works for you because you're a techie. Of course it works. They sucked you right in there. They're a techie, you're a techie. You bashed. You bashed. What about your wife? Does that draw her in? I was like, no, actually it doesn't. She could care less about these techie dials. It's not compelling for her at all. But The good news is the people who designed this are smarter than me. So when they did this, they figured out I might have a wife who's not techie. So they said, hey, we'll make 4 dashboards, and you can just turn a dial to get the one you want. So when my wife drives the car, she drives with this dashboard. All that techie stuff is gone. Instead, on the right-hand side there, you have a little bush with little white petals. And the better your mileage, the more petals you get. Is that compelling for her? Yeah. Would that do anything for me? Not so much. Not so much. How do we do that with controls? How do we make personal space management of controls that compelling? How do we make it so simple anybody can do it and so compelling everybody will? That is the challenge. And I would argue because the value of lighting systems in their value creation mode, in making healthcare more effective, schools more effective, retail more profitable, business space more profitable, that part of LED systems is going to drive the volume of projects that will demand systems be this simple to do. Because if they're not simple, you can't get those done, and users don't like it when suppliers don't do what they want. And a supplier will come along who will figure it out. And that is the challenge we face as suppliers in this industry. It's going to get figured out. What's our role going to be in the resulting new world? That's the interesting question and the challenge for all of us. So with all that said, is there anything else? Yeah, one more thing. If you'll bear with me for one more little story. So I have in here 2 stainless steel screws that are maybe 2 inches long, give or take. And those 2 steel screws 6 months ago were right there in my ankle. Now, why I needed screws in my ankle goes back to some ice in January. We're not going to talk about that because that's more a story for a bar than here. But I wound up with these 2 screws in my ankle. And what I found with screws in my ankle, even after the bone had healed and the rest of it was kind of healing, was I couldn't really run. I could walk, I could go up and down stairs, I could manage, but I couldn't run. And I couldn't play tennis. And I kind of like playing tennis. So 6 months ago, my surgeon pulled out his knife again and went in there and pulled those screws out. And with a certain amount of work and effort and conscious attention, I got back to where I could run, be flexible, agile, and at least fast enough to go back to playing tennis, almost at the level I was when I quit playing tennis. And it occurred to me, because along with what I do in the BACnet world, I do some individual consulting on strategy for companies that are trying to change. It occurred to me there are companies that sort of behave like they have screws in their ankles. Right? They can't really run. They can't go fast. They're not flexible. They can't play the game they used to play of being first on the scene or best at this because they've acquired these screws in their ankles over time. So whether you're in the owner, operator, specifier, consultant role, or integrator, product, hardware, software role, I would urge you to look at your own organizations and see if your organizations act like they have screws in their ankles. And if it does, I'd suggest you try to remove them because success in this world that's coming is going to depend a lot on speed and agility, the ability to move to a new place quickly. Now, if you can't remove those screws yourself, I recommend you get a business surgeon who can help you because there really isn't any choice. To succeed here, you need to have speed and agility. So if your organization isn't that, you might want to think about how to get it there. Armageddon, right? The end of the world of building automation as we know it. In my opinion, hey, it's coming soon to a business near you. Thank you.